Support for Swan Song is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. The game featured in this episode features heavy strobing whenever a unit is selected, so if you're photosensitive or prone to seizures, please don't watch the rest of this episode. Thanks. As you know if you're a longtime viewer of the series, I tend to be quite interested in how the Japanese internet feels about WonderSwan games. The entire premise behind Swan Song is to determine if Western opinions of the library are rooted in reality or dismissal based on first impressions and a long-time language barrier. One of the things I find fascinating about researching the WonderSwan library is how often there's at least one person out there devoted enough to the game I'm researching to put together a blog post about it, or a walkthrough website that has somehow survived over 20 years on the internet. But one of the things you don't really come across much for WonderSwan games is consensus. Very few games are universally held in high appeal, and I guess it's only fitting that we're marking the halfway point in the series with a game that is universally held in high appeal. That game is SD Gundam G Generation Gather Beat, which is not only a flagship game for the system, but also a turning point for the series it belongs to. It was released on July 13, 2000, developed by Vanguard and published by Bandai. To fully lay out the genealogy of this game, we're going to have to rewind all the way back to the Super Famicom. The SD Gundam franchise really flourished on the original Famicom thanks to the Gashapon Senshi series of action simulation games. These were turn-based strategy games like Fire Emblem or Super Robot Taisen, but with the novelty of having fights play out in real-time side-scrolling action minigame battles instead of canned animations. By the final game on the Famicom, that novelty element was scrapped, opting instead to adhere to a more traditional war simulation game format. That subseries would be succeeded on the Super Famicom by the SD Gundam X, SD Gundam GX, and SD Gundam G Next trilogy developed by Vanguard, and much later by G Sentry on the PlayStation and Gashapon Senki on the WonderSwan, as previously covered in episode 69. A new series was also launched on the Super Famicom, known as SD Gundam Generation, developed by Tom Create. Instead of focusing on original scenarios like Gashapon Senshi, SD Gundam Generation was instead a way of packaging scenarios from existing Gundam works into playable turn-based strategy game campaigns. This game was one of the flagship titles for Bandai Super Famicom accessory, the Sufami Turbo, which allowed Bandai to manufacture their own games with a lower-cost proprietary cartridge format and allowed them to sidestep Nintendo's requirement to handle manufacturing and licensing of all games released on their platforms. One unique quirk of the Sufami Turbo was that it had two cartridge ports on it, which allowed the contents of two games to be mashed up in a manner not unlike the lock-on functionality from Sonic & Knuckles. For SD Gundam Generation, this meant you could combine two cartridges and use both of their units in the same campaign. The SD Gundam Generation series was reborn on the PlayStation as SD Gundam G Generation. The original 1998 G Generation served not only as a collection of all the scenarios from Generation that had come before it, but they adapted so many more Gundam works into scenarios that it had 4 times the content of the entire Generation series prior. In 1999, G Generation 0 contained all of the content from the original G Generation, plus a bunch more adapted works, with the ability to transfer your save over. In 2000, it happened again with G Generation F, which adapted pretty much whatever scraps were left to adapt into video game form, once again letting you carry over your progress from 0. And this is where G Generation starts hitting a pretty big issue. Their rate of adapting Gundam works into playable scenarios was outpacing the production of new Gundam works to adapt, and if that's what G Generation is all about, then it's going to be an issue for Bandai if they want to keep pumping those out at a yearly cadence. A few months after the WonderSwan's launch, Tom Create released SD Gundam Emotional Jam, which repurposed sprites from Vanguard's G Next title and put them into a G Generation style battle system. SD Gundam G Generation Gather Beat is Vanguard playing the Uno reverse card on Tom Create, using Emotional Jam's engine and systems as a base to create the first true portable G Generation title. Distinct portable G Generation games would continue to be released regularly alongside the mainline console series until the Sony PSP was released, and was able to run perfect ports of whatever was being released on home consoles. And from that point, G Generation games were developed for home consoles and handheld simultaneously. Gather Beat also marks the turning point in the series where G Generation stopped being about faithful adaptations about existing works and instead about telling original stories using existing Gundam characters. This set the stage for G Generation Neo on the PS2 in 2002, which marked the beginning of the second generation of console G-Generation games, mostly focusing on original scenarios. G-Generation Gather Beat is a massive refinement of Emotional Jam's engine. Unit sprites are much larger and easier to discern on maps, and menus no longer use annoying half-width fonts that are difficult to read, opting only to use them for dialogue during story sequences. A lot of features which were present in Emotional Jam are cleaned up and made much more user-friendly, such as stacking units into a single tile, which now have a maximum limit of 3 units instead of 5, allowing them to move, attack, and defend as a group. Special character skills were also reworked into the character ID system, which behaves more like the spirit ability system from Super Robot Taisen. There is also just much more information displayed in menus to help you make more informed strategic decisions. This feels like it learned a lot of the interface patterns from the Super Robot Taisen games, and while I think that did make it a much more enjoyable game to play, I also understand why Japanese fans jokingly refer to it as a Gundam-only Super Robot Taisen game. It is lacking some of the distinctly G-Generation mechanical flavor that the console entries in the series had at the time. Gather Beat's story is an alternative timeline called the Neo 1 Year War, which has a lot of similarities to the 1 Year War from the original Gundam trilogy, but weaving in characters from other Universal Century works, as well as G Gundam, Gundam Wing, Gundam X, and Turn A Gundam, which all took place in alternative timelines. Almost every mission has a number of special scripted sequences you can trigger by causing characters that normally wouldn't have had the chance to interact to fight or talk to each other. I wasn't really thinking about who my pilots were and accidentally triggered one of these fairly early on in the game, and it put a smile on my face. Speaking of special triggers, each mission has a number of secret objectives which can lead to upgrades, unlocking bonus missions, or changing the fates of certain characters later on in the campaign. Gather Beat, being a flagship title for the system, supports its fair share of accessories, including the Wonder Wave infrared communication device and the Wonder Gate, which allowed WonderSwan games to access the internet via supported mobile phones. The Wondergate service allowed players of the game to download a helping of new units, buffed units, and new pilots to bring into their fleet once they had completed the campaign. The Wonderwave integration allows for communication with the Pocket Station app for G-Generation F. This not only allows you to generate currency passively in the background to import back into your Gather Beat save later, but also import characters from your Gather Beat save into a minigame included on G-Generation F's bonus disc, G-Generation Action Version. This minigame is based on Gather Beat itself and gives players the choice between fighting battles automatically like in the G-Generation games, or returning to an older action battle sequence like the Gashapon Senshi Famicom games. It's a neat idea, and I hope to explore this Wonderwave and Pocket Station integration in an upcoming video once my save data is in proper order. I was incredibly dismissive of Emotional Jam in the episode I did about it, and I have to confess that I shouldn't have. While researching for this episode, I found some Western pages listing what they said were new features in Gather Beat coming from Emotional Jam, and more often than not, they were straight up wrong. Almost all of Gather Beat's key systems were technically there in Emotional Jam, but they were exposed through really clunky interfaces or felt like they were abandoned midway through development. Gather Beat really polishes everything up and sets up a solid foundation for SD Gundam strategy games to come on the WonderSwan. This game is also a bit special to me personally because of the role that the SD Gundam G-Generation series has played in making my videos for this project better. During my long multi-year hiatus, I was watching older episodes on the channel and became dissatisfied with a lot of the earlier episodes I had made about Gundam and mech-related games because of my lack of knowledge and disinterest in them. I felt like I was being overly dismissive of them because of that. Well, if the goal of my video series was to try and determine if Western audiences had been unfairly negative towards the WonderSwan's game library, I couldn't really be putting out videos with that same kind of dismissal out into the world unless it was truly warranted. Ultimately, I wanted to educate myself about Gundam, and what better way to do so than by picking up G-Generation F for the PlayStation. So imagine my surprise when I was unboxing the game and realizing it would be my first PlayStation game with Wonderwave support. All things considered, Gather Beat is a really solid, well-executed start to the G-Generation series on the WonderSwan, and all of the praise that it gets feels incredibly well-deserved. Considering how many improvements Vanguard managed to pack into this game, I'm really curious how the eventual sequels Gather Beat 2 and Mono Eye Gundams will turn out.